We convened in 2011 and for 2 years compiled an archive of questions, thematics, and challenges that were involved in intergenre work that we each managed in distinct ways. And Kim and Lisa defined intergenre in terms of crossing disciplines, but mostly crossing from one mode of research or presentation to another, which then became kind of a broader and broader form of crossing as we kind of hung out together more and more. And various members have sought new and multiple modes, forms, audiences, publics, institutional domains, physical spaces, material practices, and relationships to professionalism over the last 2 years. Affect for us came up in our explorations and also in discussions about how and why we wanted to do this work. It also came up, frankly, in supporting each other and doing what felt for most of us a little bit outside the bounds of what our department's colleagues and internalized disciplinary consciousnesses would allow. And so many of us maintain a meaningful relationship to scholarly modalities and then also experience unbelonging within the normative genres of knowledge production, but then also sift through that unbelonging by mixing and crossing genres. We hope that thinking across genres today becomes an opportunity for different stakeholders in this room to consider multiple and diverse relationships to affect and inquiry. We recognize that crossing genres isn't a desire or a challenge for everybody here in the room, but kind of witnessing that process could be interesting for different people from different standpoints. And one note that our group is a little larger than those presenting today, so I want to just really briefly mention some of the other people involved in the explorations, just so it doesn't seem weird to leave them out. Anna Barker in Slavic languages, Miriam Belli in history, Art Bareka in theater arts, Terry Gellert in film at Grinnell, Sabine Goltz in cinema arts, Christine Munoz in communication studies, Susan Murty in social work, Charlie Williams in American studies, and presenting today are my colleagues Kim Marra, and I've kind of put up the intergenre stuff behind me, but she's in theater arts. She's also a performance artist and playwright. I see how we laugh, like we're not really those things. You can go on. Lisa Heineman in history, gender, women's, and sexuality studies, who's also an author and memoirist. Sarah Kanouse in art and art history, an interdisciplinary research artist, filmmaker, and designer who's written books, made films, and done performance critical practice projects. And Loyce Arthur, my colleague in theater arts, who's a costume and puppet designer and ethnographic playwright. And if you don't mind going back. Oh, yeah. And so we're going to watch their explorations and then do an interactive activity together where we think about some of the challenges and practices that come up in the context of crossing genres. And I want to talk about knowledge problems, which is something we talk about a lot, but also feeling problems. So I don't want knowledge to be the horizon of legibility in the room, even though at a university that tends to be the currency, but lots of different kinds of problems.
For my entire career, I've remained safely on the scholarly side of theater studies, writing requisite books and articles in fairly traditional scholarly prose, until I arrived at my current book project, which I initially conceived as a cultural study of women and horses and performance, mainly in New York City, circa 1900, when the island of Manhattan was home to 130,000 equines. I got into this project because, along with theater and women, my other great passion in life has been horses. I come from generations of horse people. My maternal grandfather bred racehorses. My mother was an avid horsewoman. And before I returned to college and became a full-time academic, I was a serious competitive rider. So I'm a performance historian who happens to have a lot of arcane, politically outre, Anglo-US American upper middle class knowledge of horses and riding that I actually thought I could use. I began my research in the usual scholarly pose, seated at my desk, hunched over a primary document, The American Horsewoman, 1884, by Elizabeth Carr. This was the first riding manual written by and for American women. I was reading Carr's exhortation to her American women readers to follow the British model of mothers handing on equestrian knowledge to their daughters when I looked up and saw this photograph sitting on the shelf of my study of me and my mother riding together in a mother-daughter class in 1970 at a suburban horse show on the Philadelphia main line where I grew up. I realized I not only had the photograph depicting the very transmission of female equestrianism that Carr was talking about, I also had the saddle my mother was using in that picture because I had unearthed it along with the photograph from her basement after she died. Moreover, I was using that very saddle in the recreational riding on the horse who just died that I had resumed post-tenure in middle age here in Iowa. So I began relating to these objects not just as family heirlooms, but as archival material productive of historical knowledge. I reflected in particular on the archival power of saddle leather that lasts for lifetimes of absorbing skin oils and sweat of my mother and me and the numerous horses that graced our lives. Taking an old saddle that had been in storage for years and revivifying it by using it on horseback again makes the past come up in very physical and material ways as the intense friction of bodies that happens in riding heats up and activates the oils infused by previous generations in my family, human and equine. When I was first invited to give a talk about this, I mentioned to my partner, an acting teacher and theater director, also on the theater arts faculty, that I was thinking of incorporating these objects somehow into my paper presentation, and she asked, "Well, are you going to do it in riding clothes? And what about a horse?" Slide. Quickly, with a costume and set, I was performing, and thankfully she helped direct me, because physically accessing the wider Anglo-US American equestrian past through my own family experience immediately brought up the deep affect that drives our scholarly obsessions but is kept at bay by academic standards and modes of presentation. Slide. For me, there was the fraught, unresolved relationship with my alcoholic mother, who saw the butch lesbian I became as an academic as some sort of profound evidence of her failings and disappointments in life. There was also the history of trauma exposed in the severe bodily scars that we, like generations of women before us, acquired in horse-related accidents and yet kept riding. And there was all the tension between loving these amazing animals and accounting for our own complicity in the vast historical system of exploiting them for human pleasure and power. Slide, please. My partner had the skills and heaven knows the patience to help me as an untrained performer manage and channel all that affect through the artistic discipline of rehearsal and performance, all the ways in which motion begets emotion begets motion, so that it could assist and not obscure historical illumination. This turned into a 3-year journey of developing and performing this piece at various conferences and ultimately in a professional Chicago venue in a series of performances about animals curated by Holly Hughes. And now, trying to use all that embodied and affective knowledge I came to understand more fully through performance in writing my scholarship, I realize that I'm not just telling a historical story or documenting the use of a performance studies methodology. I'm also burying the dead, or at least conjuring them, so I can walk more freely with them, because burying them is not really possible. Thanks.
I'm one of those people who at academic conferences, while everybody else on my panel reads from a text, I'm the one who talks freely from bullet points. Now that I'm doing this intergenre work, I'm finding myself having to read. There's something to think about regarding genre and academic custom. I'm going to read a small bit from my recent memoir, Ghost Belly. All the advice books and listservs said the same thing. Don't torture yourself with questions about whether it was anything you did, whether you shouldn't have continued lifting your toddler in your last trimester, whether you shouldn't have had that wine before you even knew you were pregnant. Almost surely it was nothing you did. The truth is, you'll probably never know for sure what caused the stillbirth. For 60% of stillbirths, the official cause is unknown. Even the doctors don't know. Don't torture yourself. Don't worry your pretty little head about it, I mocked. Not good enough, I spat. You'll never know for sure comes after you try to find the answers, not as a way to prevent you from asking the question. Awaiting the funeral, my mother asked, eyes churning, what everyone else was too polite to ask. What most people found it unnecessary to ask, since of course the answer must be yes. Would it have turned out differently if it hadn't been a home birth? No, I said, and told her what our midwife Deirdre had told us when she'd visited in the hospital. I had had a sudden placental abruption. Placental abruption means the baby stops getting oxygen. The baby tries to breathe, its lungs are mature, but gets only meconium. No oxygen to the brain, 4 minutes till severe brain damage, 6 minutes till death. Hospital standard for a C-section is 30 minutes decision to incision. Even an emergency C-section wouldn't have been fast enough. I had my answer. But I kept asking. This was a research question. It was a job for my analytic mind, which retreated periodically in those days to make room for my screaming and wailing mind, but which never wandered very far off. It was good at what it did. In 2008, I had 2 books under consideration by academic presses, 1 historical monograph and 1 collection of essays on a human rights topic. I was also pregnant. In November of that year, I had a full-term stillbirth, and I started writing. When friends understood or learned that I was writing about stillbirth, they asked me, with a little excitement in their voices, are you doing historical research on pregnancy loss, on stillbirth? To me, the question felt alternately kind of boring. I just wasn't moved to do historical research on this topic, and in some ways, a violent intrusion. It seemed to me to reduce what had just happened into something much too small and boxed off. The idea of writing about, let's say, 60 to 80 million Germans over what we historians call the short 20th century seemed too contained, too boxed up, too limited. Whereas writing about my experience meant writing about everything that was important in the entire world. I ended up doing, and was doing from the beginning, the genre that creative writing types call personal writing, personal essays. If it turns into a book, you call it a memoir. Along the way, I became intimately acquainted with the genre of playwriting. As I collaborated with a playwright, we had a series of conversations that then led her to write a play called Still, that was not a dramatic adaptation of my experience, but rather not only fictional, but also fantastical. The baby is walking around the stage and speaking and developing human relationships. I also remained, as I had been, intimately acquainted with the process of making a visual art, as my then 16-year-old son first painted the casket lid, and then a couple years later made a short animated film about the stillbirth. The book came out about a month ago. Actually, official release date was March 18th, so quite recent, and I have now started to do public readings on it. When I speak to bookstore audiences or to women's groups, they understand the book as a memoir, and they speak to me as a memoirist. When I speak to academic gatherings, there are always 1 or 2 people in the group who have read the book, who raise their hands and say, this isn't a memoir, or it's not just a memoir, it's an autoethnography. I say, thanks, I think. I'm a historian. I know nothing from autoethnographies. I'm not sure I've ever read one, but I appear to have written one, at least in some people's interpretation of that genre and what it is I've done here. The reason they say that is because of essentially the excerpt I just read and the implications it has. That is the 2 I's in memoir, that is the protagonist I and the authorial I, who are related but not identical people, are both scholars. They have this analytic mind. And so as the I first went through the experience and then later contemplated it and wrote about it, that's why they're not identical I's, they have different relationships to the experience, they're separated in time. those two eyes approached this experience both as a deeply embodied one, as something absolutely permeated by affect and emotion, but also as a person who is inclined to look around and think critically about the politics of maternal health care, about turf wars between midwives and the medical profession, about practices of grieving and funerary ritual. I will let some of you hopefully read it and tell me in an email whether you think it's a memoir or autoethnography. I now feel, like Kim, I realize in your presentation, we've talked so much about our projects, but we are both now at moments of, in fact, having to continue to rethink because of what's going on now. I toss this out here as a scattering of thinkings about what genres we're working in, and the multiple genres that I've encountered along the way, and the ways that I initially very much resisted having this be in any way interpreted as an academic exercise, and the ways in which my being as an academic is nevertheless coming back to haunt me in ways that now feel comfortable because the book is out there, I've done what I need to do, and people can call it what they want. That's what I'd like to say to get us started with our part of the discussion about affect and genre. Thanks.
It is truly my pleasure to deliver this bulletin on the recent activities of the National Toxic Land and Labor Conservation Service. The National TLC Service is a wishful federal agency dedicated to the vigilant detection and continual exposition of military ecologies. Since the service was established by fanciful legislation about 3 years ago, we have been hard at work collaboratively developing a justice-oriented national commemorative response to the staggering domestic impacts of the Cold War and the American atomic arsenal. We live in a world in which toxicity is not the exception but the norm. The Cold War isn't over. It is not even past. Consider the following. The United States nuclear arsenal currently stands at about 5,100 warheads, about the same number as in 1957, but with vastly greater capacity. Nuclear weapons bases and facilities cover more than 15,000 square miles of land. The global stockpile of fissile materials includes 495 tons of plutonium-239, which is hazardous to humans for about 240,000 years. The yet-to-be-recognized demand for artists and humanities scholars to put their unique skills and talents toward the service of government accountability inspired the wishful establishment of the National TLC Service. The TLC Service is charged with contesting the widespread but inaccurate perception that the Cold War is safely past and that its toxic legacies have been resolved. Our response is to confront the U.S.'s ongoing toxic open door by challenging dominant ways of knowing yet ignoring the remains of the Cold War. We seek to model how government might operate differently by embracing controversy and complexity, and by facilitating difficult and sometimes emotional dialogues, and by responding to the physical, environmental, and cultural impacts of the American nuclear state. Our primary project is the National Cold War Monuments and Environmental Heritage Trail. This project requires us to work with various publics to map the ongoing differential impacts of the Cold War. These include exposure and disease hotspots, and overinvestment in defense economies. Our trail will incorporate both well-known and unknown sites. We are especially interested in places that are well outside of ordinary Cold War geographies, such as minor subcontractors, training facilities, currently operational infrastructure, and civilian adaptations of military sites and technologies. Last October, we launched the first in a series of design charrettes to plan the route of the trail and to propose a series of regional monuments, permanent and ephemeral, performative and material. The charrette is an architectural and planning methodology in which stakeholders are brought together to collaboratively share information, brainstorm design solutions, and identify their needs. 17 participants spent an entire day engaging with the environmental, political, and conceptual legacies of the Cold War in Illinois. Responding to and critiquing the example of the proposed Manhattan Project National Park, which celebrates the engineering genius of scientists and the selfless patriotism of the everyman, we asked the participants to sketch alternative routes through Illinois atomic geographies. And here is sort of one example. This group developed a performative event that is a series of railway journeys starting at nuclear sites that are far-flung in Illinois, converging on Chicago to share a report back of their experiences, and then gather in Chicago to go to Washington, D.C. for an advocacy and lobbying session. Participants then discussed possible images, gestures, and signs that somehow evoked the nuclear legacy. These conversations set the stage for the second design activity, proposing a monument to the health, environmental, and cultural impacts of nuclear weapons and wastes. Some of these monuments took relatively traditional form in large-scale landscape or architectural projects, such as this Morning Monument, which involves the use of recycled water to speak about rainwater carried fallout, which really blanketed the entire country throughout the above-ground testing period. Others were more unconventional and more multi-sided, like the Coffee Cup Monument, which is a proposal for a series of critical coffee mugs comparing the economic and social consequences of rural nuclear waste sites and rural prisons. As I hope these very brief examples suggest, these charrettes allow us to bring together diverse stakeholders as well as younger generations for whom the nuclear weapons complex functions as mere background radiation. We are less interested in finding a common ground than in better understanding the many material and discursive layers that already are right beneath our feet. Seeking out anecdotal and local narratives, as well as authoritative historical sources, results in a trail that is neither linear nor uniform. It will have many spurs and divergences. It will be largely unspectacular. It will double back on itself. Many sites will be multiply interpreted, as well as curated in juxtaposition with one another, so that we can begin to understand the relationality of military geographies. Together, we will chart a trail that includes multiple speculative monuments to accommodate many specific positions, as well as subordinate or underrepresented sites and themes. The realization of the National Cold War Monuments and Environmental Heritage Trail will proceed slowly and incrementally. It is an emergent trail, whose process of creation is as much a part of its path as a route described on a map. Thank you.
I'm having a good time, I'm having a great time. At Iowa Carnival, at Iowa Carnival. I'm having a good time, I'm having a sweet time. Celebrate with Caribbean fun all day long. Colorful dress with Iowa making smart. Don't be late, come give it all you got. There goes hockey and children dress fine. Come online, it's carnival time. I'm having a good time, I'm having a great time. At Iowa Carnival, at Iowa Carnival. I'm having a good time, I'm having a sweet time. Celebrate with Caribbean fun all day long. having a good time. I'm having a great time. At Iowa Carnival. At Iowa Carnival. I'm having a good time. I'm having a sweet time. Celebrate with Caribbean fun all day long. Jump and move for Iowa Carnival. Mass from Trinidad, London and Brazil. Up the riverbank until Dubuque Street. Dance and move to the Caribbean beat. I'm having a good time. I'm having a great time. At Iowa Carnival. At Iowa Carnival. I'm having a good time. I'm having a sweet time. Celebrate with Caribbean fun all day long. Colorful dress with Iowa making smart. Don't be late, come give it all you got. There goes hockey and children dress fine. Come online, it's carnival time. I'm having a good time. I'm having a great time. At Iowa Carnival. At Iowa Carnival. I'm having a good time. I'm having a sweet time. Celebrate with Caribbean fun all day long.
As a costume designer for the theater, usually my job is to write with a text or to interpret and take a story and translate it into a visual representation of the playwright's words. And so I also have a strong interest in Caribbean and Brazilian carnival traditions. I grew up with those traditions in Grenada and the West Indies. And for a long time, I attributed them as part of what shaped my aesthetic as a designer. And I was sort of separated from them in terms of knowing that they were there as part of my work, but not necessarily engaging with them as part of the process. Getting to this project, I think, was about a 20-year process. So I happened to take a trip to Côte d'Ivoire in Africa and saw a mask performance, which to me was one of the most enlivening performances that I've ever seen. So then going back and looking at, well, what is it that a mask performer does? A couple of things came to mind, or I learned. The African tradition that the whole body is a mask, means that the performer totally embodies whatever they're trying to represent. At the same time, they have to maintain control. They can't give over completely to that image. So that started to inform my work as a designer. When I came back and started to work with Carnival, that seemed to be exactly what was happening in that process. At the same time, I and other designers that I know who are carnival designers have become increasingly concerned because there is a perception of Carnival as just a big party with a lot of drunken people. And knowing what is under that became something that I wanted to be part of. And being involved in academia, it seemed that I was in a position to be able to do that, to understand that. So then I was just going to write about it. Carnival designers don't just put up pretty pictures and provide these. There's these underpinnings that go all the way back to African ritual and performance traditions that is part of their work in addition to whatever story they're telling. So that sort of would have been a simple way to do it. I decided to try something a little bit different. I decided to present a carnival parade here in Iowa City. So rather than just being an outside participant, to actually be part of that process that goes on. So what has happened, though, that was sort of perhaps unexpected, but as an artist, sort of I had a fear of writing about what I do. But certainly being part of this intergenre group has kind of helped me kind of not only strengthen the stories that I'm telling and how those stories are told, but in understanding that in that process of writing, it then actually helps to inform the visual storytelling that I get to do. So to me, this is the project as it evolved became a narrative process on multiple levels. So there's the visual narratives, there's the narrative history that underlies all of this, that's based in the Caribbean and Brazil. And then there's the interesting narrative. What we asked people to do is to share their stories of Iowa with us, and that we were going to translate those into visuals. Well, on one level, some people were comfortable with that, and I sort of learned that I wasn't the only one that had this fear of writing. But also there's a fear that their stories aren't good enough, that people don't have good enough stories to get turned into art. And so that also, I think, was empowering for me. And then to think about that and to encourage them as well as myself to look at this and write about this and what it does for all of us in that process. So then you have a narrative of what people are trying to convey and what they are embodying, either from the designer or from their own hand, but then also what narrative starts to run through it just in the fact that they are there and what unfolds on the street. So there was a whole nother story that got told once we did the parade itself and how that evolved over that particular day. So to me, it's been interesting in going from the idea of the embodiment of the African masks to the embodiment of the Iowa mask. And it's also something that's continuing because we will do another parade this June 7th here in Iowa City. So this project continues to evolve over time. Thank you.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.